Thanks for joining me for another Podcasters Row. This is King of Podcasts, and glad to have everybody here joining me here on this series once again. The season 2, if you want to call it that, because this way this kind of works out. When I put another request out, and I want to thank the folks that quoted with a WQWOTED. I really want to appreciate them because they have been making a great inroads for me, finding some great guests to have here on the program. And once again, have another wonderful podcaster to go ahead and feature here on the series. And the series we're going to talk about today is called Tracing the Path, exploring how events and decisions in the 20th century are interconnected. I'm here with Dan Morris, the host of the program. Dan, thanks for being on us.
Hey, man, appreciate it greatly. Enjoy this very much.
So Dan R. Morris, just to make sure to clarify, but you're the president of Audience Industries, a company that helps small businesses and entrepreneurs with online business models. But also you have been a freelance writer for Deloitte, iBlog Magazine, Podcast Magazine, and you've also been a social media tech blogging researcher and also hosted the Amplify program on blogging and social media podcasts. So you've had all your, ducks in a row, and you've had quite an extensive resume. What I want to ask now is, there were inspirations for bringing this program to light about tracing the path. And 3 names I'm really interested in the fact that you thought of. You were inspired by Paul Harvey, Charles Kuralt, and Andy Rooney. Now, as far as I know, 2 of those have actually where I've heard them on radio when it comes to Paul Harvey and Charles Kuralt. I did not know if Andy Rooney ever did radio, but they're all commentators. And then tell me what it was about those 3 growing up that made you say this is something you want to do.
Man, I got to tell you that, if you're listening and you don't know who Paul Harvey is or Charles Kuralt, and I suppose that's possible because they're not big names now. But there was a point in time when I think Paul Harvey was maybe one of the most famous people in America, especially on the radio.
Absolutely.
And he had a couple of different shows, and in today's world, shows kind of has a different meaning. And one of his shows, called The Rest of the Story, was really like 11 minutes, 7 minutes. It was very short for a show, and I'm not exactly sure how that would work now. I'm not sure how it worked then. Like, how do you sell an 11-minute show to, like 5 million stations? But
still, it was done anyway. I mean, it was a 15-minute program you'd have in the afternoon, right before noon. Like that, at least for me, on what I know was like you had a morning broadcast, an afternoon broadcast, and Rest of the Story, which would close out the day.
So for me, Rest of the Story was at noon.
Oh,
yeah, it was actually at like 11:49 or something.
Right, because
sometimes I would be on the way to a lunch meeting. And this is kind of important to why I started the podcast, but I would be on the way to a meeting and the Rest of the Story would come on, and I didn't care that I was late to the meeting. It didn't matter to me. I wasn't going to turn off the story. Like, I was going to hear the end. And I realized at some point in time that story was that moment when there's a story playing on the radio, there's audio in your ear, and it's creating a movie in your head. And I didn't want that to stop, whatever that was, every day for that period of time. And so as an adult, just remember, I have 11 kids. I just remember finishing our first podcast and realizing that what I wanted to create is I wanted to recreate that feeling that Paul Harvey gave me, where you don't want to turn the radio off, where you want that wow sensation that you got listening to it, because his story was about a place, an event, or a person that you knew, but it didn't get told to you who or what it was until the very last second. So you would be listening and you'd be hearing all about little Jack, and then at the very last minute you would realize he's talking about JFK. It'd be like, wow, I had no idea that happened to JFK. So I wanted my kids to have that thing exist in their lives. And, the way YouTube works and the way TikTok works and all those, it's not quite the same as the way those old stories were.
Well, there's a lost art in storytelling and delivering the stories. and the way it's presented. Now, in the same way, I'll put it like this. So this mindset is it's radio itself going back to the golden age of radio. It was a throwback to that. And Paul Harvey really fit that role. The other thing, too, is that people might not have heard Paul Harvey because of him being predominantly on talk radio. You wouldn't have heard him on music radio. So I didn't catch on to Paul Harvey until maybe, into the 1990s myself, because that's when I finally got more into talk radio. When you get older, you just kind of like fall yourself into it. But for music radio, I would then give a parallel in Casey Kasem.
Oh, I love Casey Kasem.
And that's who I idolized a lot growing up, because it's a storytelling. And it would either be through a long distance syndication, or it would be a story he told about an artist. And there are some people actually that do some of that in music. I've heard some people that will take that whole that formula of like, here's a little nugget of something, and then it will go ahead and tell the story. It'll be either about a song or about an artist and how they grew to be. And then you hear the story, like, and I can't tell you how many music stories I've heard of. And it's because Casey told me about it. Indeed. It still holds today, because some people just have a grip on how they go and do that. Now, Dan, when you're doing your show, one of the things that is required in that storytelling and that delivery, a lot of those people do a lot of scripting. Like for Casey, even from when he was doing music radio in the 1960s, he scripted his show. And I think it was his program director either in Detroit, and then when he was in California, he scripted his whole show and gave stories on everything. Is that something that you have kind of done for yourself when you prepare for the program?
I write a 32-page paper by hand on a notebook every month.
Wow.
For the podcast. And it takes 5, 6, 7 days of research and writing, figuring out the story, rewriting, sometimes 9 days because I have an idea and I can't find the wow moment. And then I got to switch. I got to come up with a new idea, which, it's not my favorite, but if it doesn't make me say wow, then I can't. I mean, it's not going to make anybody else say wow. So I got to move on.
But now also what you're doing is you're taking particular stories are they stories that are submissions that you want to just do yourself? Or is it something that it's a story that you've always wanted someone else to go and tell, but you're taking that part yourself now?
So a few of them, like my very first one was the Oregon Trail game that we played as a kid. And I'm 51 years old, but I am from the generation, and there's only a few of us, where you start school and there are no computers in the classroom. But by the time you're done with school, computers are part of the classroom. So for me, computers didn't become part of the classroom until 4th grade. And I remember it vividly, 4th grade, when all of a sudden there's an Apple IIc at the back of the room, and that Apple IIc has Oregon Trail game on it. So what I have learned along the way about the Oregon Trail game, for me, and maybe this is really the thing that kind of kicked off the podcast, was I don't think that people knew that the Oregon Trail game is why Apple computers exists. It's not, Apple computers didn't make the game popular. The game made Apple popular.
Right.
And the way that happened is in Minnesota prior to Steve Jobs, because Minneapolis was kind of like the computer mecca of the United States for a period of time. Because there were so many big companies like IBM and Univac in Minnesota, the school boards were run by people who worked at computer companies. And so the school boards were interested in getting computer software into schools. And they created a program called MEC, where teachers actually wrote programs for the class, for schools. And some of them were like little math programs that kids could do in the back of the classroom while the teacher was teaching if they needed help. Well, in one case, 4 students wrote this Oregon Trail game. And it became very popular in Minnesota, in the schools. And at the time, it was played on computers that had no screen. So it was actually a little printout came and it said what happened, and you had to respond on this teletype machine very quickly, and then another printout would come, and you would make your way across the United States, on the Oregon Trail, and it became very popular.
But that was one of the things where Apple needed that extra hook. You just can't just have it. Oh, you want to just print out and you want to go and create some code or some program. You needed the gaming aspect was the extra selling point to make it so that people were going to engage on those computers early on and adopt them and really enjoy them. I get it. It's a fascinating story. And if people want to take time to it, but that first story you did was August 2019. And of course we go into the pandemic. Of course we get right into the whole lockdown. And what better, when you're stuck at home, I'll tell you what, I did a lot of podcasting during that time.
Oh, yeah.
Sat really right where this chair where I'm at, not this very chair, but in this very same spot, and recording like crazy because I had all the time to go and do content, all the time to go and prepare content. So in those couple of that first part of 2020, you were able to go ahead and take a lot of time to be able to get real work into some stories you went into. How the hostess Twinkie survived death, the life of Paul Harvey, how Curious George escaped Nazi Germany. Like this, you really went through some areas. And the thing is, too, is that you go through a real scope, a wide range of different stories, because there's stories that I feel like there is a demographic you're trying to reach out to of people that are very much Gen X, maybe baby boomers, and trying to go and draw in some people that are a bit nostalgia driven. They'll want to go and find this show as well. So they come in and look for it and like, oh, wow, look at all this that we learned.
Yeah. And right now, I think, and I don't know how this happened, and this is a little bit crazy, but a lot of nursing homes actually have an activity hour and they have an audio program hour, and a lot of them play Tracing the Path.
Wow.
It's where I get a good number of listeners is that and truckers, older truckers.
Yeah.
And it's because if I'm going to tell a story about the Bay of Pigs invasion, like if you're 20 years old, you're learning about the Bay of Pigs as I'm telling you the story. But if you're 60, you already have all these preconceived notions in your mind. You know about it. You've heard stories. And if I can totally twist your interpretation of what it was, if I can teach you something you didn't know about that, I mean, it's much more of a wow moment. Like, holy mackerel, I had no idea, even though I thought I knew everything. Now everything's been flipped on its head. Kind of like the Wicked musical, like all of a sudden, like, whoa, I had no idea that the bad witch was really the good witch.
Yeah. Let me ask you now, when it comes to some of the stories you've told, I'm sure, that we've had certain stories that have been talked about that we'll see them featured in maybe like film documentaries, or you might see something where somebody else might have heard the story from somewhere else. So, for instance, I've seen plenty of times where the story of the Charlie Brown Christmas program, 1965, how they came to be, how well Charles Schulz pushed back against the networks to make sure the message of Christmas, the way he wanted presented, was intact.
Yeah.
When you have the story of Muscle Shoals, what's his name? I can't forget. What was the name that the guy that ran it? Rick, forget his name now. But the guy that ran the studios there, in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, that brought up some of the greatest soul, R&B artists and blues artists and all these other people that came in to play rock music. They all came in here, and there was a great documentary I've seen on that. So there are some stories you might have heard about, and some stories that are very popular, but that's like you're finding an extra niche or another nuance to it that people might not have heard about, or you go more into something that you wanted to learn about yourself. When you look at what other materials out there and people that have told that story, what is it that you do that you work on to try to go make it the story that you're trying to tell that would make it say, well, I've heard this before, but I didn't hear it like that?
Oh yeah. So that is definitely the crux. Like with Muscle Shoals, like, do you know that Ford, president, the Ford of the Ford Motor Company, at one point in time, he decided he was going to turn Muscle Shoals into a city. He was going to build an entire manufacturing city there. It was like a 15-mile long building where everybody in the building was going to be working on cars, but then like to the right side of the building was going to be farmland that would help feed the people in the plant. And on the left side of the building was the river that would help take the cars to the rest of America. And also Helen Keller's from there. So taking all of those things and making, for me, the Muscle Shoals story is more about the place. Like how many amazing things come out of that place than just that unbelievable musical story. It's much bigger than the documentary. Although the documentary made me think, wow, I got to look that up and see what else there is to that, that they didn't even fit in the story.
It was a lot more than you go. Rick Hall, that was the name. I was just looking going back.
Yeah.
But the thing is, in the documentary, I've watched it a few times. They focus so much on him. Yeah, it's a tragic story for him with his family and what happened to him. I get that part. And also the betrayal of the other producers that decided to go and run their own studio. And there's a whole thing to go on with that.
By the way, I didn't cover any of that stuff.
Right. But that was the part they wanted to go after. But like for me, when they focus on the music, oh my God, that is like amazing. Because I mean, just the way they kind of set up. And I guess sometimes I'll let you get some inspiration from some of these kind of places where if there's a good documentary that I've watched that I really enjoy, because I guess that's another thing. Are there any other materials that you've, besides the hosts that you've listened to growing up, are there any documentaries or any kind of stories that you've seen out there that's one that you like, you got to watch it again and again? I have mine, but are there any that you see out there and you look at it and you say, damn, that looks the way that like I want, because I keep coming back to it once again and again. And you want to create that for all your podcasts for Tracing the Path, because you want those stories to be so compelling. And for some people that watch documentaries, we're gonna repeat them.
True. I don't really have one that I rewatch or that I go back to in my head. At least when you mentioned that, I can't think of anything. I do like the ones that really awaken you to something you should have known your entire life. And like, how did I not know about Muscle Shoals? Like, how did I not know those swampers? Like that whole thing is crazy to me. And even Sugar Man in South Africa, the Sugar Man thing is pretty cool, but he was just part of a much bigger story that involved Coca-Cola and the overturning of the apartheid regime.
Yeah.
So I ended up telling that story where Sugar Man is part of it. But it's a much bigger story than just him, even though the story of him is a fairy tale that will never, ever happen again in the history of time. But, and it's just amazing, but it's just part of really the big story. So I call it Tracing the Path because I want to really get back to like, what is the actual story? Where's the beginning of that?
Yeah.
Like, why start in the middle?
When you bring up Muscle Shoals, okay, so with the documentaries I've watched, the one on the Wrecking Crew, the California studio session players that played on like every hit record in the 1960s into the early 70s.
Yeah.
Everything. And they're so good on everything that they do together. And to the point where I go look for the music that they were featured on, that they performed on, and like the secret that nobody ever knew, they never got credit for their production, but they do this amazing work. Right now, I just finished an audiobook on the Wrecking Crew because I can't get enough about their story or their music and just learn more about it. The other thing too is, the documentary style that I do like, that I see a lot of, that I've watched a lot of different documentaries of, is BBC. I think they are tremendous at storytelling. And to do it on visual, it's very difficult, but like there are a handful of stories that they can tell. One is their version of American Bandstand called Top of the Pops. And they actually do a year-by-year yearbook of all what they're doing. And actually, I would love to go make a recommendation for American Bandstand because no one has ever told that story about Dick Clark and American Bandstand. I have never seen one comprehensive story about it.
Interesting. I actually have a list of about 600 topics that I go to every month and rethink, okay, what could I make out of that? For instance, John Williams, the composer.
Yeah.
I did a story on John Williams because many people just don't know even the rest of his family. Like his son was the lead singer of Toto, the 80s band that came up with the song Africa.
What?
Yeah, but did you know that the band Toto,
Right, they're studio session guys themselves. It's a super group of session guys.
they're the
Wrote
guys
that
who
score.
play
Yeah.
on Michael Jackson's The Thriller and Bad. They're the band that he plays with.
Well, because I saw the Yacht Rock documentary that Bill Simmons did on HBO, and he heard that story, and I got on, and now I got to start looking for stuff on Toto because Steve Porcaro, and I forget the Porcaro brothers, and I forget who else. It's like that's an amazing story, and Toto actually that's the other thing too. I'll ask this too: is that when you learn a story about some of these artists, like Toto was kind of like, yeah, they're good, and I have listened to their songs over and over, and I just got run down by them because they put on the radio so much as a kid.
Oh yeah,
but when I hear this story about Toto again, I'm like, wait a minute. What a story about these folks. And like, look what they were behind. I'm like, okay, now listen to them again. It's like because there's a reinvigoration. You ever had that happen when you go into a story like that? And it's like, okay, if it was a musical artist or somebody that you heard about, and it was just talking about ad nauseum. But when you go ahead and hear that story again, a newfound respect comes in when you find out about what happens. Is that something you also experience yourself?
well, that's also what I want to try to create. I want to be the person that does that for you, that tells that tale. And I wouldn't say that it's a documentary because a documentary has a different connotation. But
okay,
but it's definitely a story. Like even with John Williams, his dad is the guy that plays the piano on the old Looney Tunes cartoons. Like just the whole idea that his family is bigger. Tracing the path of the Williams family is the whole thing. Not just
Carl Stalling. Carl Stalling is related to John Williams?
No. John Williams Sr. is the pianist.
Goodness.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, there's something about, and I can understand being inspired to go and tell a story about John Williams because any of his orchestrations that he's done, I get goosebumps. Play the Super Bowl.
Oh yeah.
I get goosebumps. Or Star Wars. Like and the thing is, he's still alive, right? And he can still put out it's amazing orchestrations. The detail, there's so much to be said and so much to idolize about some of these folks. Is there anybody you've had a chance that you idolized a lot that you were like, I'm so glad I got to tell this story because I really wanted to tell this?
Well, I would say Paul Harvey.
Yeah.
Nobody had ever done a Paul Harvey documentary of sorts, which I did before. And actually, a side story to that is sometimes when I finish these stories and then I publish them, I get calls. So one of the calls was from Paul Harvey Jr.
Oh,
who calls me on the phone and says he listened to it and he'd never heard that before and he loved it. Another call was from the editor of Ripley's Believe It or Not. She said the story that I wrote about Ripley had information they didn't even know.
Yeah.
So they created a cartoon about Robert Ripley and they quoted from Tracing the Path, which I thought was cool. And then the Oregon Trail, the guys who wrote Oregon Trail called me and said that I was the first person to have actually told the story the way it needed to be told. So, that kind of stuff is really cool to me. Like the idea that Paul Harvey Jr. would call, like how interesting is that,
What can you say about the audience has caught on to the show so far? And I'm sure you must have some people that just, when they're kind of like hooked on this kind of content, have you heard from any of listeners that have been out there or just had a lot of comments about, or if you had any idea of what has really been some of your best content? And if that kind of steers the direction of what you talk about when you see numbers on it.
I haven't used the data to dictate future stories.
Okay.
Because it, for me, it's all about the wow. Like, holy mackerel, I had no idea what that was. And I would like to, like the Martin Luther King episode is by far the most listened to episode. Maybe 10 times as much as the rest. It might have 1 million listens now. And that's because I break down the I Have a Dream speech into the different parts and where they all come from. It's not like they just came out of his head. They did come out of his head. But because he had experienced different things in those moments, existed other places in his life, and he put them all together into one speech. So then because that's the most listened to, does that mean I should break down other speeches? And for me, I'm like, no, I just need to keep finding the wow. I just need to keep finding that moment that makes you go, whoa, I had no idea. And that's pretty much where I keep it at. Sometimes companies, will call and see if I'll write their story, and then, I'll get paid. But then just to think, did I keep doing that just for the money? And I'm like, no, it still has to be, a wow moment. Like I can't change the focus of the show. It still has to make you have that same feeling I had listening to Paul Harvey, which was, holy crap, I didn't want to turn that off. It has to have that, or it's just not the same show.
Yeah. So you've gotten to 63 episodes in this format. It's amazing how you've been able to get to this point. And again, I understand why it takes so long to go and prepare for each episode, putting this together. Is there anything that says to yourself, okay, some 6 years later, there's no stopping you. You're still interested in this. You're doing it in a format and a pace that works for you, that you're not overwhelmed by, well, I need to put another show out next week. You're putting out basically once a month, and it's been working for you.
Yeah. Once a month is great, except my whole goal right now is to make my wife more famous so that I don't have to do anything that involves anything other than making more episodes.
Yeah.
Because, the podcast not every podcast makes a ton of money, and I haven't been able to focus on that. So, what's funny is when you have bills to pay, you either chase the things that pay the bills, or you hope that the things you chase will pay the bills.
Yeah.
So sometimes you have a passion like the podcast and you just want to make it work, but a bill comes up. So you have to take a client project, cause it'll pay.
Yeah.
And then, you do what you can to get to keep it going. But right now my wife, who has a really big blog, she's a published author. She's got a couple million fans, on Facebook or something.
Yeah.
It's only going to take a little bit more before her entire world will pay the bills. And then it would be great if I could do one a week. That would be unbelievable. But then it would be like a full-time job, because it's a lot of research and storytelling, writing it down, moving the parts, creating the arcs, changing things so that everything fits together smoothly. It takes work, and I've never been the kind of guy that actually wanted a job. I like my digital lifestyle where, I haven't had an alarm clock since 2008. We've been full-time online since 2013.
Yeah.
We don't have a boss. We do our own stuff. I love that idea. And, in a perfect life, Tracing the Path would be my only job. But at the same time, it's a lot of work, so then it would actually be a job. So I have to kind of weigh that. Like, do I want to take the wow out of my own life so that I could keep making stories? Or do I want to do like 2 a month, which would be pretty doable, pretty easy. And that would be unbelievable. That'd be the coolest life. Like I really like, I like going to the, the library in the Library of Congress. I'm a member of the Library of Congress. I do a lot of research there. And I actually got there because of Ken Jennings, who's the current host of Jeopardy. Yeah. I read his book, and I wanted to do a podcast story on one of the things he talked about in his book. So I wrote him, and then we've been in pretty good constant, conversation for the last couple of years.
Yeah.
And he got me to the Library of Congress, and I do research there, and I just love that, I love being there, learning things, seeing stuff that nobody's ever seen before, and putting together stories. Oh man, it's just unbelievable, that whole experience. And I'd love to do that every single day.
Yeah.
But looking at me through the French doors of my office right now are 3 children who would like to eat anytime now. I look at them, and then I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot at some point in time, I got to go back to paying the bills.
There we go. Well, Dan, I appreciate you coming on and telling me about the story about Tracing the Path, and what an amazing story it was. I had questions written out. I didn't use any of them. I was like, we're going to go right at it. It's like there was something about I took some time. I was just saying, man, it's the direction that you went, and I totally can understand how you got in this direction. But I will say that I admire what you're doing because this is an undertaking that you're doing.
Yep.
Not easy to go and do. But for those that will take the time to go and do attention to detail on a podcast like this, it's incredible. So Tracing the Path with Dan R. Morris. Of course, find it where all major podcast platforms. It's all there. You got, and I'll tell you, this is one of those where you want to binge watch. Again, 63 episodes already up to date, and so many different stories you've gone through. And if you want to go, just tell me give me maybe like 4 or 5 of the episodes you've really enjoyed doing. That when you go back and like, even for yourself, you'll obviously listen back to what you've done. Are there any of the episodes you really like that you really say, man, this is one of my real favorites that I'll come back and listen to it again and again because it was just so, the story that I got to pull out of that was so great.
So McCann Erickson was a major advertising firm in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. They were the focus of the show Mad Men.
Correct.
Which I think was maybe HBO. I don't remember where that was.
A&E. Oh, it's AMC.
A&E. All right. They, as an advertising firm, they impacted the world in ways that you just can't imagine. I mean, they helped make Coca-Cola what it is, with the song, I'd like to teach the world to sing. And that whole process, all of the different slogans that and those moments, to me, I just kept one after another in that story. I'm like, holy crap, this goes back to McCann Erickson as well. I just kept thinking, wow, I cannot believe all this came out of one firm.
Yeah.
And then another would be Levi's, the blue jean company. And it wasn't Levi's necessarily, but it was the color blue that was astounding to me, and how hard in history it has been to make the color blue. Just by, it comes from a rock. Like it's hard to have made it. When the ancient Egyptians, if you had something blue, it came from lapis lazuli, which is something you can now find in Minecraft. But it was a really hard rock to find, and making that all the way through to Levi's and how they colored jeans, and then amazingly, and unfortunately, to the Holocaust, where the color blue, which is cyan, I believe from a printer,
right,
is actually the origin of cyanide, which is the gas that they made for that thing. And then going through the whole process of that and finding out that BASF, the company that used to make our VHS tapes,
yes,
made the gas for the Holocaust, is just amazing to me. Like how did that company still exist? And then we bought all those VHS tapes from that company. I'm just like, holy crap. How does that exist? Why did they not get put in jail?
That's wild.
Why were they not all in jail? I don't know. But anyway, that was crazy to me. And you said, the mention the Charlie Brown episode. To me, Charlie Brown episode, why he has a small tree, why Charles Schultz included a tiny little tree is part of that story. I mean, that was pretty cool to me.
Yeah.
And if you're interested, I would say listen to the episode. But to me, that I hope people listen to that every year. And I actually, in Nashville, they do like an orchestral concert at the City Winery, where I read the podcast while they're doing the music. Tell the old story, of all of it, all the way back to the 1600s. That story starts. So those are pretty cool for me. I love those kinds, and I am so excited for the future because there are stories out there, the wow moments that I don't even know exist yet. But I know that every month I do another one, and each time I'm like, holy mackerel, I had no idea. So I'm always excited that this month I'm going to find another wow moment. And I'm hoping that the nursing homes of America will be smiling when they listen to this audio program and think, wow, I grew up with that. I had no idea.
There we go. Dan Morris, host of Tracing the Path here on Podcast Just Wrote. Thank you so much for being with us. And real quickly, we mentioned where the people can find the podcast, but is there a website that everything all emanates from? Social media you want to push out there? Tell us how the people can stay connected.
Well, I am Dan R. Morris everywhere, Twitter, Facebook, all the places. But otherwise, tracingthepath.com is the website to go to.
All right, tracingthepath.com. All right. Thank you, Dan R. Morris, here for being with us on Podcast This Show. Thank you again for being on, and what an amazing way you put a show together. And we'll let again, I'm going to go ahead and go down the rabbit hole and search for those episodes, because there's a handful I could definitely would say I really want to go catch up on. Guys, thanks for coming on and joining me, and thanks, listeners, for coming in. We'll talk to you next time.